Maren sat on the worn step outside the dimly lit boarding house, her elbows pressed against her knees and her thin fingers trembling against her temples, as though she could somehow hold back the flood of thoughts that never allowed her rest. And Calder, riding slow down the quiet street after tending his horse at the stable, noticed the fragile outline of her body hunched beneath the lantern glow, and felt his stride slow, as if something within him demanded he not walk past. She looked as though she had not slept for years, the hollow shadows beneath her eyes speaking louder than words, her shoulders sagging with the weight of nights too long and too cruel. And there was a tremor in the way she breathed, uneven and shallow, like someone afraid even of silence. He tipped his hat back, debating whether to intrude, yet his nature never allowed him to leave pain unacknowledged, so he let his boots click gently on the dirt until she looked up, startled by his presence, and he said softly, "You look as though the night's been unkind to you. Has it always been this way?" She blinked at him, her lips parting with hesitation. Then she lowered her gaze again, ashamed of even being seen in her exhaustion. But Calder crouched near her, not close enough to frighten, not far enough to feel careless. And he added in a voice steadier than the lamp flame above them, "I don't mean harm, miss. Only seems to me you carry a burden heavier than one person should." For a long while, she said nothing, as though deciding if she could trust a stranger with the truth that had ruined her. Then finally she let her voice out in a broken whisper. "I don't remember the last time I truly slept, not since the day I lost everything." Calder frowned, though not at her. His jaw tightened at the cruelty hidden in her tone, and he asked with patient calm, "What was it that took your peace?" At that question she pressed her lips together, as though silence itself was safer than speech. But the weight of it seemed to crack her chest, and she shivered in the cool air before finally forcing the words out. "One wrong step, one night in the wrong place, and they said I belonged to shame. I never did. But the world decided I did, and it never let me forget." Her voice trembled as she said it, and her eyes carried a pain so deep Calder could almost hear the voices of those who had spit her name like poison. And for a moment he thought she might break apart completely, but she held herself upright, as though she had learned to endure humiliation, like a soldier learns to endure battle. Calder stayed crouched, his broad frame steady and unmoving, his eyes fixed on her as though she were not broken at all but still whole. And after a silence heavy enough to make the night itself pause, he let out a slow breath and lowered his hand until it rested on the wood beside hers, not touching. Just near enough to be felt. "Then tonight," he said with quiet conviction, "you'll rest in my arms. I am here for you." Maren flinched at the tenderness, her lips trembling not from fear, but from the shock of being offered dignity instead of scorn. And for the first time in years her eyes softened, daring to hold the possibility that perhaps she was not alone in her exile. She did not answer with words, her throat refused them, but her gaze, wet with unfallen tears, met his. And in that gaze lingered the fragile, flickering spark of something long denied her. Hope that peace might finally come. Maren had never meant to step into that house, yet she remembered it with such burning clarity that even now, years later, the memory clawed at her like sharp nails across her skin, robbing her of rest and branding her as something she never was. She had been no more than 19, walking home from the dressmaker's where she had worked long hours hemming sleeves by candlelight, the street unusually dark because the lantern posts had gone unlit, and when the wind began to whip around her, carrying the echo of laughter from men too loud and women too painted, she sought refuge at the first door, with light spilling through its cracks, not knowing it was the doorway to the brothel that stood at the edge of town, its red lamp swinging like a beacon of ruin. The moment she crossed the threshold, the laughter turned into silence, sharp as knives, and a dozen eyes turned toward her, women with their dresses too low and men with grins too hungry, their voices dropping into murmurs that soon cut into open sneers. "A fresh one. She's come to sell herself," one man said. And though Maren had stammered, shaking her head, insisting, "No, I've lost my way. I thought this was a boarding house." No one believed her, and worse, no one cared. She had run out of the place, her cheeks burning, but the damage had already been done. The next morning the whispers spread faster than wildfire across the market square, her name on everyone's tongue. And by nightfall her employer asked her not to return, for customers do not want dresses sewn by a girl who sells herself. That one mistake, a step into the wrong door, had chained itself to her identity, so that no matter how she pleaded, no matter how cleanly she lived, the town had decided she was no better than the women in that house, and though she had never once taken a man's coin, her shame was heavier than if she had. Calder listened in silence as she spoke, his breath even and his eyes steady, as if daring her to believe that he would not recoil as everyone else had. And when she finally broke, clutching her hands together and whispering, "Since that night I've not slept. Every time I close my eyes I hear them laugh. I hear them say my name like filth." His expression did not harden with disgust, but softened into something she could not name. He shifted closer, his knee brushing the wood step, and said, "One wrong turn doesn't damn a life, Maren. If the town couldn't see you for what you are, then let me see you instead." She looked at him as though he were mad, because no man had ever stood on her side without asking something in return. But the weight in his tone felt like truth hammered on an anvil, and she realized with a jolt that for the first time since that night, someone was listening without judgment. The tears that came were not loud or heaving, but quiet, slow, and raw, sliding down her hollow cheeks until she wiped them away in shame. But Calder reached gently, lifting her wrist, not forcing but holding it still, and whispered, "Don't hide them. They're proof you're still human, still worthy." That broke her further. Yet in the breaking, there was relief, as though her guilt had finally been witnessed and not condemned. The next day, Maren ventured into the market with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her head lowered, as if the cobblestones themselves might scold her. But hunger had driven her out, and she had no choice but to face the whispers she knew would gather like crows. The butcher's wife narrowed her eyes the moment she approached the stall, muttering loudly enough for those behind her to hear. "Strange to see her buy bread when we all know what she earns it with." And the women near her tittered, covering their mouths as though the sound of her shame was entertainment, while one man called across the square, "Careful, boys, she's already seasoned at the house on South Street," his laughter booming, sending a flush of heat up Maren's neck as she gripped the coins in her fist until the edges cut into her palm. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the dust, but Calder was there. He had followed at a distance, watching her falter under the weight of ridicule, and now he stepped forward with the slow, deliberate strength of a man who feared nothing but injustice. He planted himself between Maren and the jeering crowd, his voice carrying across the market like a bell. "Enough. You've all made your judgment from a story you never cared to understand, but I heard it, and I'll tell you plain. She walked through the wrong door one night, nothing more. If any one of you believes a mistake makes her unworthy of respect, then you've forgotten your own sins." The square fell quiet, stunned that a man like Calder, a rancher known for his silence and his fists of iron, would waste his breath defending a woman branded by rumor. But he went further, reaching into his pocket and buying the loaf of bread Maren had been too shamed to purchase, placing it in her hands as though it were a crown and not a crust. She trembled, not because of the bread, but because someone had finally broken the silence of her exile. Someone had declared before the very people who had ruined her that she was not what they claimed. The butcher's wife scowled, muttering under her breath, and a few men laughed nervously as though unsure whether to mock Calder or leave quietly. But no one dared step closer. His stance made it clear he would take on anyone who tried. Maren's chest burned with both fear and gratitude, her eyes stinging as she whispered, "Why would you do this, Calder? They'll turn on you now." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening, and said for all to hear, "Because lies are lighter to carry than truth, and I won't let you carry them alone any more." That sentence struck her deeper than the cruelest word ever had, and though the crowd eventually scattered, she remained frozen, clutching the bread, as if it were proof of something she had thought lost forever, that she could still be seen as human. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of his voice still echoed. And for the first time in years, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter, enough that her eyes began to blur and her body longed for sleep, though fear still clawed at her. She realized with a jolt of wonder that maybe Calder's words had planted something greater than defense. They had planted the possibility of peace. 2 mornings later, the sheriff himself rode out to Calder's ranch, his badge glinting in the sunlight and his face drawn with the unease of a man caught between law and gossip. Maren had been helping Calder carry water buckets when the horse's shadow fell across the yard, and her body stiffened like a deer that had caught the scent of hounds, for she knew what his visit meant. The town was not finished with her yet. The sheriff dismounted, hat in hand, and spoke as though rehearsed. "Calder, folks are uneasy about you keeping company with, well, you know her past. They say it ain't proper, that a man like you ought to know better than to bring shame into his household." Maren's throat closed, the buckets trembling in her hands until water spilled across her dress, and she wished desperately that she could vanish back into the earth, because hearing the accusations from his lips made them heavier than all the whispers combined. But Calder set down his tools slowly, walked forward with a calm that made even the sheriff shift back on his boots, and replied, "Her past is a lie told so many times it turned to stone, but I won't let it build her prison. You tell the folks this ranch stands on truth, not on their cowardice. She has done nothing wrong, and she'll stay here as long as she wishes." Maren gasped softly, stunned that he would speak with such finality, and the sheriff sighed, muttering about unrest and consequences. Yet Calder's voice cut through again, sharper now. "If they've got unrest, let them bring it to me, not her. I'll face every one of them." The sheriff nodded reluctantly and left, leaving behind the echo of his horse's hooves. And when the sound faded, Maren turned to Calder with tears streaking her face, whispering, "Do you know what you've done? They'll hate you now. They'll call you a fool, a traitor, a man ruined by a woman who isn't clean." He stepped closer, took the buckets from her trembling hands, and said softly, "They can call me anything they want, but I know the truth. And the truth is that you're the most honest soul I've ever met. And if they hate me for standing by that, then their hate is just another kind of lie." Maren's knees nearly gave way, for no one had ever spoken of her that way. No one had ever separated her from the stain of rumor and handed her dignity back like it was the simplest act in the world. That night, when she tried to rest, her mind replayed the sheriff's words and Calder's defiance, 2 forces colliding in her chest, and though sleep still evaded her fully, for the first time her eyes closed without fear of nightmares, because she knew that outside, in the silence of the ranch, a man was watching over her, not for duty or pity, but because he had chosen to. It happened the very next Sunday when the church bells tolled across the dusty streets of town, and Calder insisted Maren ride with him, despite her trembling hands clutching the reins. She had begged him not to drag her into the public eye again, but he only said quietly, "If we hide, they win, and I won't let their lies keep you prisoner." And so she rode beside him, heart hammering as the townsfolk turned to stare the moment they entered the square. Whispers swelled like rising smoke. That's her. The girl from the house. Calder's ruined himself. Until Maren felt each word slicing her skin, but Calder's hand brushed hers on the reins, steadying her as he guided her towards the steps of the church. Then, before she could protest, he turned to the gathering crowd and raised his voice with a strength that silenced even the harshest murmurs. You've condemned a woman for nothing but a mistake of address, for walking into a place she never meant to be, and you've chained her with words she never earned. I've worked beside her. I've seen her kindness. I've watched her fight to hold her head high when every one of you tried to bow it low. If you think less of her, then you'll have to think less of me, because I won't let her stand alone. The square fell into an uneasy hush, the preacher shifting uncomfortably, women clutching their shawls tighter, and one man shouted bitterly, "She's marked, Calder. She'll never be clean!" Calder's reply cracked through the silence like a hammer on an anvil. Then none of us are clean, for every one of us has sinned in silence. The only difference is that she's been honest enough to suffer for what she never did, while the rest of you hide behind gossip. Maren's chest constricted as the words sank into the air, raw and unshakable, and for a heartbeat she thought she might faint. But then she saw something astonishing, a few heads lowering in shame, a woman drawing her child closer as if to shield him from cruelty, and even the preacher's stern face softening as though realizing how far the whispers had gone. Calder reached for Maren's hand openly, lifting it so all could see, and in that simple act, she felt the tremor of her chains breaking, not because the crowd believed her yet, but because one man had given her back her place among them with the certainty of his touch. That night, lying in the small room Calder had given her, Maren closed her eyes, and for the first time in years felt sleep hovering near, fragile but real, as if his words in the square had built a wall around her heart strong enough to keep the voices out, and she whispered to the darkness, "Maybe tonight. Maybe I'll rest." The moon hung low that night, silver bleeding through the cracks of Calder's cabin, when Maren stirred restlessly on the cot, her fingers twisting the thin blanket as though she were holding back a storm. And finally she rose, bare feet brushing against the wooden floor, and whispered his name, unsure if she even wanted him to hear. Calder, already awake, lifted his head from where he had been mending a strap by lamplight, and when he saw her trembling in the half-dark, he set the leather aside without hesitation. "It's eating you alive, isn't it?" he said softly, not accusing, not demanding, only offering his voice like a steady hand across a raging current. Maren clutched the blanket tighter, the weight of all her sleepless years pressing against her chest, and with a broken breath, she finally told him the truth. The foolish night she'd followed a cousin into town, thinking it was just another boarding house. How laughter and perfume had clouded the hall, until she realized, too late, it was a place where women sold what they never should have had to sell. How she turned to leave, but the door was already closed in her face, and the madam's sneer followed her into the street. "They marked me that night, Calder," she whispered, tears spilling freely now. "And no matter how many times I said I hadn't done a thing, the story was told, and I believed it myself. That maybe just stepping inside meant I'd lost who I was." Calder rose then, each step deliberate, and he stood before her until her chin lifted, until her eyes met his through the blur, and he said with quiet fire, "Walking into the wrong place doesn't stain your soul. What stains a soul is standing by while another drowns. You fought your way out, Maren. You've carried that shame alone, but I see you. I see the woman who sings to herself when she thinks no one's listening, who saves crumbs for the sparrows, who still thanks God before every bite even when the town spits in her direction. That's who you are." She broke then, sobs shuddering through her as she pressed her hands against his chest. And for the first time he wrapped his arms around her, not with hunger, not with claim, but with the steady warmth of a man who had chosen to bear her burdens as his own. Her cheek against his shirt, she felt her racing heart slow as though the weight of years lifted. And when he whispered at her ear, "Tonight you'll rest in my arms, because I'm not letting go," she believed him. And for the first time since that cursed night long ago, she let her eyes close, not in fear, but in fragile peace. The rooster had only just crowed when Maren stirred, surprised to find herself still wrapped in Calder's arms, her body heavy with the unfamiliar weight of actual rest, the kind that came without tears. She blinked against the dawn filtering through the cabin slats and felt a pang of disbelief. Had she really slept through the night? She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, while Calder, already rising, slipped on his boots with the calm certainty of a man preparing for a fight he knew would come. By the time they stepped outside, the air was filled with murmurs. A small knot of neighbors gathered at the edge of the yard, eyes sharp and voices cutting. "There she is," one woman hissed, clutching her child's hand as though Maren were some disease. "Spent the night under his roof, did she? Guess we know what she is after all." A ranch hand spat in the dirt, muttering about shame brought to decent land. Maren froze, her knees weak, shame curling up like a serpent ready to strike, but Calder took her hand before she could retreat. "Say what you mean," he called, his voice carrying across the yard, low but steady as iron. One man, a burly fellow named Judd, stepped forward, face red with scorn. "You've taken in filth, Calder. A woman known for walking into a brothel. Whether she touched a man there or not, she's tainted. And you, sleeping under the same roof? You disgrace every one of us." Maren's stomach twisted, tears pricking her eyes. But Calder didn't flinch. He moved closer, his grip on her hand firm, and his gaze pinned Judd with such fire that the murmurs stilled. "You call her tainted because it's easier than facing your own cowardice," Calder said. "She stumbled into a den she didn't choose, and you've chained her to that mistake ever since. But I've seen her courage when no one else would. I've seen her kindness, her faith, her strength, and I'd sooner cut out my own tongue than let you call her less than whole." The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers turning uncertain, for Calder's voice held no defense for himself, only fierce protection for her. Maren stood trembling. But something inside her began to stir. Was this what it felt like to be defended? To be seen without accusation? Judd spat again, but softer this time, and when Calder stepped closer still, broad shoulders squared, Judd looked away. "I won't ask your permission," Calder said, raising Maren's hand before all their eyes. "She is mine to protect now, and if any man dares call her less than what she is, a woman of honor, they'll answer to me." A hush fell, broken only by the creak of a wagon wheel in the distance. And in that silence, for the first time in years, Maren felt something stronger than shame rising in her chest, something that looked a lot like dignity. By midday, word of Calder's defiance had reached every ear in town, and when Maren and Calder rode toward the square to buy flour and seed, the air was already thick with the sting of judgment. Children whispered behind their mothers' skirts, men muttered by the hitching posts, and before long Sheriff Howland himself stepped out from his office, his badge glinting sharp in the sun. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he carried the authority of law like a heavy yoke, and his gaze, when it fixed on Maren, felt like a hammer striking the last nail into a coffin. "Maren Hale," he said, loud enough for every bystander to hear. "You've been called before me more than once on account of the rumors surrounding your character. Now you show up in this town with Calder Holt at your side, and tongues wag that you spent the night under his roof. I need the truth. Are you what they say you are?" The silence that followed pressed in on Maren like iron bars, her throat burning, the old shame rising so fast she almost crumpled under it. She wanted to hide, to vanish, to let the lie settle over her like it always had. But Calder's hand found hers, steady and warm, his thumb brushing once across her knuckles. "Sheriff," Calder answered, his voice carrying not in anger but in unshakable calm. "You don't need her to answer a thing. She's no harlot, no vagrant, no disgrace. She's a woman who lost her way one night, and a town decided that was enough to bury her under. I won't let you or anyone else dig that grave deeper." Howland's eyes narrowed, shifting from Calder to Maren, who finally managed to lift her chin, though her chest still trembled with fear. "I never sold myself," she whispered, her voice breaking but clear enough to carry. "I was lost. I walked into the wrong place, and for that mistake you've all made me a ghost. But I am not what they say." A murmur rippled through the crowd, doubt cracking like ice across a frozen lake, some faces softening, others hardening with scorn. Howland studied her, then Calder, then the faces around him, and though his jaw remained stiff, he gave a short nod. "Then let it be on record," he said. "From this day, she stands as she is, with Calder to speak for her. Anyone who raises their hand against her raises it against him and against me." He turned back to his office, leaving the crowd to stew, and though whispers still coiled like smoke, a line had been drawn. Maren swayed, her breath rushing out as though she had been holding it all her life, and Calder slipped his arm around her shoulders, steadying her as he murmured for her alone. "You spoke the truth, and you still stand. That's more courage than most of them will ever see." And in that moment, for the first time since her fall from innocence, Maren believed that maybe peace was not beyond her reach after all. Sunday came like a summons, and though Maren wished to hide in Calder's cabin forever, he urged her gently to walk beside him into the little whitewashed church at the edge of town. The pews creaked with judgment as they entered, every eye lifting, then narrowing, whispers trailing like dust in their wake. Maren's palms sweated against the worn Bible Calder pressed into her hands, his silent promise that she belonged there as much as any of them. But when Preacher Latham rose from the pulpit, his gaunt face framed by a crown of gray hair, the room tensed as though it had been waiting for the blow. "There is sin that masquerades as virtue," he thundered, his voice echoing off the rafters. "And a man who would bring a scarlet woman into God's house spits upon the holy ground we gather on." The words were aimed like bullets, and though he never said her name, every head turned to Maren. Her throat closed, her knees wavered, and she nearly fled, but Calder's arm locked firm around her, steadying her in place. He rose slowly, towering over the pew, his voice quiet but cutting clear through the preacher's roar. "I've heard enough of men deciding a woman's worth by rumor. You speak of scarlet, but I see only scars left by your cruelty, not her sins. And if this house cannot make room for her truth, then it is not God's house at all." A gasp ran through the congregation, some leaning back in fear of the preacher's wrath, others leaning forward as though at last someone had broken the chain of silence. Maren's heart pounded, torn between terror and awe at Calder's defiance, and though shame had caged her for years, a single tear slid down her cheek, not of humiliation, but of release. Latham's hand slammed against the pulpit, his eyes blazing, but he faltered under the weight of Calder's gaze, and the murmur of townsfolk began to turn. "You mean to tell us," he spat, his voice shaking, "that you would take her as yours, before God and all of us, despite what she has been called?" Calder's answer came with no hesitation, his hand tightening around Maren's as he pulled her to her feet. "Not despite it," he said, his voice strong as steel. "But because she deserves the life she was denied, I would take her before God, before man, before the very ground we walk on. I would call her mine, and I will not bow to your judgment." The church seemed to shudder with the weight of his declaration, and though some hissed and scoffed, others nodded slowly, as though the tide had shifted by a force none could resist. Maren's legs trembled, but in Calder's grip she stood tall, her voice breaking as she whispered for only him to hear. "I don't deserve this." He bent his head until his lips brushed her hair, and answered, "You deserve more than I could ever give, but I'll spend my life trying." And for the first time in years, the hum of her shame quieted enough that she almost believed she could sleep that night in peace. The days that followed were like a storm clearing after years of darkness. The town split between those who still whispered poison and those who could not unsee Calder's unwavering defense in that church. For Maren, each step beside him felt like learning to walk in a new body, one no longer bent beneath the weight of shame. But it was Calder who pushed the truth further, who spoke to the judge, the blacksmith, the schoolmistress, and any who would listen, declaring Maren not as a shadow, but as the woman he would marry before all. By the time Sunday came again, the same church that had once felt like a scaffold became the place where the townsfolk gathered, curious and restless, their faces a mix of skepticism and reluctant respect. Preacher Latham was nowhere to be seen, too proud or too broken to stand. But Calder stood tall at the altar, his rough hand outstretched to Maren. Her steps down the aisle were slow, her chest tight, but the sunlight streaming through the high windows caught her hair like fire, and she swore she heard the hush of voices turn softer, kinder. "You don't have to," she whispered once, trembling at his side. "I already have," Calder replied, his voice carrying to every corner. "From the moment I saw her not as the name they called her, but as the woman who still carries honor in her silence, she has been mine." And then, with no preacher to sanctify the vows, Calder spoke them himself, plain words but burning with truth. "Before God, before every man and woman here, I swear my life to Maren Hale, not to own her but to stand beside her, so she will never again bow her head to anyone's shame." A hush fell, broken only by a single voice from the back, an older woman, wrinkled and weary, who said, "Amen." The sound spread like a fire, until even the sternest lips softened. Calder kissed her hand then, not her lips, and in that simple gesture Maren felt her heart break open into light. That night, when they returned to his cabin, she lay with her head against his chest, the beat of his heart like a lullaby she had never known. "I'm afraid I'll wake," she whispered. "Then I'll wake with you," he murmured, drawing her closer. And as her eyes finally closed, her breath steady and her body sinking into peace, Maren realized the title of her life had changed. She would never again be the girl tormented by sleepless nights of shame. She would be the wife who, at last, had rested in the arms of the man who made her whole. Maren had not stepped into the saloon since the night that shame had burned itself into her bones. But now, as she pushed open the swinging doors, there was no tremor in her step, only a steady strength that had been carved out of nights of sorrow and the love of a man who had never wavered. The velvet curtains still hung heavy with dust and smoke. The lamps still cast their amber haze over men with cards in their hands and whiskey on their breath, and the laughter still rose sharp and cruel, but Maren's eyes did not falter as she scanned the room until she found her. Near the stage, half hidden in the shadows, a girl no older than 19 was being shoved forward by two leering men, her wrists trembling. Her lips pressed tight as if holding back a scream. Someone sneered that she was new meat, and the crowd tittered with the same hunger Maren had once endured. The memory of that night came rushing back, the heat of humiliation, the sting of words that cut deeper than whips, the choking thought that she had been seen forever as something she was not. And yet instead of drowning her, it rose like fire in her chest. She crossed the floor, boots striking hard against the wooden boards, and her voice cut clean through the noise. "Leave her be." The words were not shouted, but the saloon hushed all the same. Men turned, eyes narrowing, and then widening as they realized who stood before them. The fallen girl who had run in shame was back. But she was not broken now. Her chin was lifted, her eyes blazed, and her hand reached to wrap around the shoulders of the trembling young woman. "She's not yours to break," Maren said, drawing the girl close to her side, shielding her from their grasp. The girl collapsed against her, sobbing into Maren's dress, clutching as if she had been handed a lifeline in a storm. A gambler near the bar muttered that it was none of her business, but before the words could gather strength, the heavy sound of boots echoed at the door. Calder entered, tall and unshaken, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his gaze sweeping across the room with the steady calm of a man who feared nothing because his truth was unshakable. Without breaking stride, he walked straight to Maren's side, slipped his worn hat from his head, and with deliberate reverence placed it upon hers. The act was quiet, but in that moment it was thunder. "She belongs to no man but to her own soul," Calder said, his voice deep and certain, and then he let his eyes lock on the keeper of the saloon, who shifted uneasily under the weight of that gaze. "Just as Maren does." The words settled like stones in water, rippling through every corner of the room until no one dared to laugh or speak. Maren tightened her arm around the girl and whispered softly, "You'll walk out of here with me, and they'll never own you." The girl's sobs quieted, her small nod pressing into Maren's shoulder, and together, with Calder beside them, they turned and walked toward the doors. No one moved to stop them. No one called out, no one reached, for it was plain to every eye that the saloon had witnessed a different kind of claim tonight. Not the claim of flesh or coin, but the claim of dignity restored. And as the night air kissed her face when she stepped outside, Maren knew the truth that had carried her here. Her pain had not been wasted, for she had been forged into something stronger, a woman who could stand in the fire and pull another free. The town had never seen a wedding like the one that gathered at the small church on the edge of the prairie, not because of its grandeur, but because of the quiet awe that hung in the air as Maren stood before Calder, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of a new beginning. She wore no silk, only a simple white dress sewn by her own hands, the hem still uneven where she had rushed to finish it. But to Calder she might as well have been draped in stars, for he looked at her as if no power in heaven or earth could undo the promise he saw in her eyes. Behind her sat the girl she had saved from the saloon, her face no longer pale with terror but lifted with shy hope, as if watching Maren had taught her that ruin was not the only ending a woman could know. The townsfolk who once whispered and mocked now sat hushed, ashamed of what they had believed, humbled by the courage they had witnessed when Calder placed his hat upon her head in defiance of them all. The minister's voice was steady as he asked them to speak their vows, but when Maren's voice faltered, Calder covered her hand with his and whispered, "Say nothing you cannot. I've already heard your heart." And so she looked at him, tears filling her eyes, and simply said, "I've never slept peacefully until you." Calder's reply was only a smile as he lifted her hand to his lips, kissed it with reverence, and answered in the same low voice, "Then from this night on, every rest you take will be in my arms." The rings were simple bands of silver, no jewels, no gold, but when he slid it onto her finger, it was as though chains long invisible had broken free. Outside, the bells tolled, and the crowd spilled into the sunlit street, not in ridicule but in applause that rolled like thunder, as though even the land itself was glad for the redemption it had witnessed. Calder wrapped his coat around her shoulders, and as they walked down the steps, the young girl trailed after them, her eyes bright, as if she too had been given back a future. Later, when the night came and the stars opened wide across the plains, Maren lay against Calder's chest in the cabin he had built with his own hands, and for the first time in years, her breath deepened, her body stilled, and she fell into sleep so gentle that even the crickets outside seemed to hush in respect. Calder stayed awake for a long while, watching the peace settle over her face, his arms firm around her until his own eyes closed, certain that nothing in this world could steal her rest again. And so the story closes, but I tell it to you as it was told to me, for I am Elias Redfeather, and I have carried it in my heart across the dust of many roads. It was the year 1872 in the Kansas Territory, a time when men thought they could own women with coin or shame. But here was a tale that proved otherwise, that dignity can be restored, that love can take root even in soil thought barren, and that sometimes one act of standing beside another can change how a whole town remembers a life. Remember this, my friends. Maren's peace was not a gift given freely. It was fought for, wept for, and earned through the steady hands of a man who refused to let her carry her shame alone. And as I close this telling, I say to you what I imagine Calder whispered each night thereafter. Rest now, in arms that will not fail. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen Maren trembling that night, unable to sleep for years, would you have reached out to lift her face too? Tell us in the comments.